The average individual takes over 21,000 breaths a day. Even when we are at rest, our body is working to bring life-giving oxygen into our lungs and exhale the harmful byproducts of energy consumption. Because most of the time it happens automatically, we don't think about the complexity of how this all happens. The mechanics of breathing, that is, the physics and physiology behind breathing, often come up as high-yield questions on your national registry. But we don't want to just learn something to ace a test. Understanding the intricacies of breathing mechanics can help clear up a lot of the clinical reasons we use the treatments we do. Physics, at least for Chris and I, has always been an intimidating topic, so we created this short lecture to break down the terms and concepts involved in respiration to help you breathe easy.
Before we jump into the pathophysiology of respiratory emergencies and airway issues, we need to talk about the mechanics of breathing and ventilation.
Overlying the physiology of breathing and ventilation is a law known as Boyles Law. Boyles Law has been known to show up on the National Registry and is something you were hopefully introduced to in medic school. But we'll go over it here because having a good understanding of Boyles Law sets the stage for understanding the mechanics of breathing, ventilation, and respiration.
Boyles Law states that for an ideal gas, and all that means is that a gas such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, or nitrogen, or basically the gases that we breathe, if held at a constant temperature and at the same amount, the volume of gas is inversely proportional to the pressure. So as the volume goes up, the pressure will go down, and as pressure goes up, volume will go down.
In order to better illustrate this, I want you to picture a balloon. To keep it simple, let's say we have a balloon with 100 particles of gas in it. Now these 100 particles of gas, they're in an enclosed space and they're pushing out against the balloon wall, creating a pressure against the walls. We'll say that the pressure these particles are creating is equal to 10 and the volume of these particles equals 20. Now we are just using imaginary numbers here to illustrate this, so stick with me. If we take those same 100 particles and cram them down into half the space, so 10 of volume instead of 20, what is going to happen to the pressure?
Well, according to Boyles' law, the pressure is going to go up, which makes sense if you think about taking a balloon and smashing down on it. The pressure increases. So as the volume goes down, the pressure goes up.
Now if you took the same balloon and kept the same 100 particles in there, but somehow I stretched it out and doubled the volume of the balloon, those particles aren't going to push as hard on the wall of the balloon, so the pressure will be less. As volume goes up, pressure goes down. That's what Boyles' Law is stating.
So why is this important to us to know? This is the same thing that is happening in our lungs and what causes us to breathe. Boyles' Law is why when we're sleeping or when we're distracted, you don't have to think about breathing. Your body naturally adjusts your volumes and pressures in your lungs, which causes you to breathe. And we're going to show you how this happens next.
To recap, Boyles' Law states that the volume and pressure are inversely proportional when it comes to gases that we breathe. So as volume goes up, pressure goes down, and vice versa. Now we're going to look at how Boyles' Law applies to breathing itself.
Before we move into how we inhale and exhale, however, we need to define a few different pressures that exist and relate to our breathing.
The first is atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is the pressure of the gases in the atmosphere itself and is external to us.
There are two types of pressures that we define that exist within our lungs and in our chest cavity. You've probably heard the term intrathoracic pressure, which means inside the thorax. This is the pressure that the gases inside our thorax create that push out against our chest wall and rib cage.
This is also called intrapleural pressure. Intrathoracic pressure and intrapleural pressure are the same thing.
We've talked about our visceral and our parietal pleural lining in our lungs and chest wall. We use intrathoracic pressure and intrapleural pressure interchangeably because the pressure in our thorax is pushing against our chest wall, which is lined with that parietal pleura.
So don't get confused and remember that these two terms are the same. Atmospheric and intrathoracic pressure are the main two pressures we will discuss further, but there is a third pressure called intrapulmonary pressure that is worth noting.
Intrapulmonary pressure specifically refers to the pressure inside the alveoli. When it comes to the mechanics of breathing, however, the two big pressures we want to discuss are atmospheric and intrathoracic, or intrapleural.
One other concept that is important for us to recognize is that gases flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. When there is a pressure gradient or a difference between the atmospheric and intrathoracic pressure, That will dictate which way gases will flow.
So if the atmospheric pressure is positive compared to the intrathoracic pressure, which is negative, gas will flow into the lungs and thorax. This then is what stimulates inhalation.
As I start to exhale and the amount of gas I have in my lungs and thus my thoracic cavity gets smaller and smaller, eventually that number will be less than the number in the atmospheric pressure. So gas will automatically start flowing into my lungs.
Once again, this is why when you're sleeping, you are still breathing in and out. All that is happening is that these pressure gradients are going back and forth. So as I inhale and build more pressure in my thorax or more intrathoracic pressure, eventually that number is higher than atmospheric pressure, and so I will begin to exhale. This is how the pressure gradients dictate inhalation and exhalation, and when combined with Boyles Law, make up the mechanics of breathing.
Now we are going to take these two concepts that we've learned, Boyles Law and the flow of gases, and put them together to see the full picture of the mechanics of breathing and ventilation, starting with inhalation.
When I take a deep breath, my thoracic muscles actually contract. This includes the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. When these muscles contract, the ribcage expands and the diaphragm pulls down.
This can be a little confusing because a lot of times we think of contracting as getting smaller, but in this case, think about a muscle contracting. When the muscles shorten, they pull the rib cage open, and when they lengthen or relax, the rib cage gets smaller.
So during inhalation, when the diaphragm contracts and pulls downward, and the intercostal muscles contract and open up the rib cage, what have we done to the volume? Well, we've increased the volume in the chest. If we've increased the volume in the chest, what does Boyles' Law say will happen to the pressure in the chest? Because volume and pressure are inversely related, the pressure will decrease.
As we decrease the pressure in the thorax, at some point that pressure will become less than or negative compared to the atmospheric pressure.
Remember, gases flow from positive pressure to negative pressure. So if the pressure decreases in the chest, air will then flow into the lungs.
This is how Boyles' Law and the flow of gases come together to stimulate and drive ventilation and breathing. The same concepts come into play during exhalation.
As air enters the lungs during inhalation, the pressure in the chest continues to increase until it surpasses the atmospheric pressure and becomes more positive than atmospheric pressure. So what has to happen? Well, the volume needs to decrease because the pressure has increased. The diaphragm relaxes and raises up, the intercostal muscles relax, and the chest relaxes and becomes smaller. And as the volume decreases and pressure increases, the gas begins to flow out of the lungs toward the more negative atmospheric pressure. This is the general mechanics of inhalation and exhalation.
In addition to the concepts we have already discussed, your body also regulates breathing through chemical pathways and neural pathways.
The main neural pathway that we need to discuss is the Airway reflex, and the main chemical pathway involves CO2.
We've done our best to only include the most important and highest yield topics in our lectures to best prepare you for the exam. The Airway reflex is one that we do see show up on the exam often.
The Airway reflex, simply stated, prevents you from overexpanding your lungs during inhalation. Remember, when you take a deep inhalation, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles contract, and this expands that chest. So when the muscles contract, they stretch and stimulate the vagus nerve, which travels back to the brain.
The brain then releases chemicals that would inhibit you from inhaling beyond a set point. This prevents us from inhaling beyond a point that could damage our lungs. That's the neural pathway. The chemical pathway has more to do with CO2.
Inside your blood vessels and heart are chemical receptors, or chemoreceptors, that take readings of the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood.
Now, if you don't remember anything else about these chemical receptors, remember this for your exam. Carbon dioxide is the main chemical that stimulates respiratory drive, not oxygen.
We mistakenly sometimes think that oxygen is the driving force, that when we have low oxygen, it stimulates us to breathe. The opposite, however, is true. Carbon dioxide is the chemical that determines whether we increase or decrease our breathing patterns.
We will see this again when we cover acid and base pathology, as well as capnography. But make sure you remember, CO2 drives respiration, not oxygen.
So these chemical receptors in our blood vessels take a reading of the CO2 content and either stimulate us to increase our breathing rate or decrease our breathing rate.
If we have too much CO2, our body is stimulated to breathe more rapidly so that we can breathe off the excess carbon dioxide. And if the CO2 reading is low, we're stimulated to breathe more slowly so that we can build that CO2 content back up in our blood.
To complete our understanding of the mechanics of breathing, we now want to define different volumes in our lungs. By defining and measuring these different volumes, we're able to better assess our patient's clinical status, response to treatments, and pathophysiology of their diseases.
The first volume we want to discuss is called tidal volume. Tidal volume is the amount of air inhaled and exhaled in a normal breath.
Tidal volume in a normal adult, and this is a number you need to memorize, is 500 milliliters. This means that during a normal breath, an individual inhales approximately 500 milliliters of air and exhales about 500 milliliters of air.
Now, if I want to, I can inhale much more than a normal breath. When I do this, I might be able to reach a volume of 3,000 milliliters. The difference between my tidal volume of 500 and the 3,000 milliliters I could potentially inhale is inspiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the additional air that I can forcibly inhale beyond my tidal volume. In this case, the difference between 500 and 3,000, or 2,500.
The same thing applies for exhalation as well. After I exhale a normal breath, I can force out additional air. This difference then is referred to as the expiratory reserve volume.
One thing to keep in mind, however, is that even after I forcibly exhale all of the air I possibly can, there's still a little bit of air present in my lungs that keep my alveoli open. This little bit of volume left over in my alveoli that prevents my lungs from collapsing is called residual volume.
Residual volume is associated with the concept of PEEP, or positive end expiratory volume.
Now, the last two volumes to define are the vital capacity and the total lung volume. The vital capacity is everything we can actively breathe in and out.
So if we add our inspiratory reserve volume with our tidal and expiratory volume together, we get our vital capacity. It's all the volumes we have discussed except for the residual volume. When we then add the residual volume to this, we get our total lung volume. I would encourage you to take some time to memorize and review this graph in your workbook and make sure you're very familiar with all of these volumes as they do show up on the exam. We've done our best to take the most important concepts and topics related to the mechanics of breathing and break them down into simple and easy to understand ideas. The concepts that we've covered are the ones that we feel are the highest yield for your exam. So let's do a quick review of what we've covered. The first thing we discussed was Boyles Law, which states that for a gas, volume and pressure are inversely related. We then talked about how gases flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, or from positive to negative. When taken together, Boyles' Law and the flow of gases along their pressure gradients becomes the basis of how and why we breathe in and out, even when we aren't thinking about it. We quickly reviewed the main neural and chemical pathways that affect breathing as well. This included the Aryan-Brewer reflex, which prevents us from overexpanding our lungs, as well as the chemical carbon dioxide, which we said is the main chemical driver of respiration and stimulates us to breathe faster or slower based on its concentration in the blood. Finally, we discussed the different volumes that we measure, including tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, and residual capacity, as well as vital capacity and total lung volume. These concepts make up the mechanics of breathing. Understanding them is guaranteed to help you on your exam, but they also form the basis for comprehending how the respiratory system functions. We say it time and time again, but understanding the basics is what sets the stage for a deep understanding of everything that follows. Commit this information to memory and you will truly thrive in your field.